So welcome back to Classical Conditioning Part 2. We ended with talking about or distinguishing between unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. We have a few more terms when it comes to classical conditioning that I want you to learn. The first term is extinction. It is when the unconditioned stimulus does not follow the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response begins to decrease and eventually causes extinction. A disappeared classical response is called extinguished, though not extinct. So let's put this in real life terms. We've given Pavlov's dogs the food, they salivated, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. We paired it with a bell or a tone. The bell now produces salivation, right? Well, if we just keep on ringing the bell and we never bring food back into the scenario, eventually the dog's going to figure out, man, this silly bell doesn't give me anything, and it will stop salivating. And when it stops salivating, it is extinguished, okay? But let's say we've done this, we give the dog a rest period, and then we start presenting food with the bell again. We can get what's called spontaneous recovery. So an extinguished conditioned response, so salivation, spontaneously recovers if the conditioned stimulus or the tone persists alone. The CR becomes extinct again. Okay? Stimulus generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli similar to the CS. So I'll give you an example of my puppies. My puppies, whenever the doorbell rings, they go running towards the door. And they're barking, and you know, my dogs weigh like 10 and 16 pounds. They're not going to hurt anybody, but they think that they are protecting our castle. And so when we're watching television, though, and somebody rings the doorbell on the TV, the dogs generalize that tone and they go running for the front door. And that's called stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal an unconditioned stimulus. So basically, Pavlov was able to teach these dogs it was only certain pitches of tone that would be paired with the food. So therefore, not all tones were created equal, and not all tones produce salivation. My dogs have figured out they actually look for more cues than just the doorbell on the TV. They look for our response. If they see us getting up and moving towards the door, then they know, oh, this is the real thing. But otherwise, they look to us and are our people going to do anything about this doorbell, or are they just going to sit on their rear ends and keep on watching TV? One thing, though, Pavlov did find is that basically you can only learn something that you're biologically predisposed to learn. Therefore, a pigeon and a person do not differ in their learning, but what we learn can be different. So, animals are predisposed to learning things that enhance survival. That is probably the key information on this slide. So another behaviorist by the name of John B. Watson, he also viewed psychology as an objective science, which is pretty much generally agreed upon today. However, what is not agreed upon is that he recommended that we study behavior without reference to any unobservable mental processes, that we just don't even pay attention to what's going on internally. And again, I think most psychologists today agree there's a combination of things and we need to be looking at the whole picture. But John Watson he took Pavlov's experiment and he expanded upon it to use it on a human and to condition an emotion. He thought, can I condition fear into a child? And so he took this little Albert, who was a baby at the time, and he conditioned fear into him. And we'll go into that in just a minute. Just be aware, though, that today this experiment would never happen because it would be very unethical to today's standards. So, Watson and his assistant Rayner with little Albert here. And after you watch the slideshow, I recommend that you watch the video that I've included. But he basically presented little Albert with a rat. Let's see. Okay, so he conditioned little Albert that whenever there was a rat in his lap, which he actually liked the rat seemed okay. One thing we know babies don't like, though, are loud, startling noises. So that makes a baby cry when they're startled like that. The loud noise would be the unconditioned stimulus. The crying would be the unconditioned response. But when he had the rat would be that neutral stimulus. It didn't produce a response, except for baby Albert seemed kind of fascinated with the rat. Basically, he would present the rat and immediately follow it with a loud noise, startling the baby. After a few tries, Albert was finally afraid of the rat. In fact, he ended up generalizing his fear to being afraid of all furry creatures. I think John Watson presented a dog, a rabbit, a rat, a fur coat, and a Santa Claus mask. As you watch the video, though, just be amused. The Santa Claus mask is pretty creepy, and I think any of us would be kind of creeped out by him wearing it. Okay? So, Albert generalized his fears to other furry objects. So here our little graph is: your unconditioned stimulus is the loud noise, your unconditioned response, fear and crying. That turned into the conditioned stimulus of a rat or a rabbit, and the conditioned response, again, was fear and crying. Please note, fear and crying are the same. Your unconditional response and your conditioned response will always be the same. Remember, little Albert generalized his fears of rats into fear of anything with white fur, including a Santa Claus mask, a rabbit, etc. Here's the deal. We don't know the long-term effects of this experiment on baby Albert because he did, unfortunately, I believe he died of pneumonia at age 6. So we don't know what happened long-term for him. A woman by the name of Mary Cover Jones used an early form of what we call desensitization to prove that fears or phobias could be unlearned. So he basically took what Watson had discovered and she made it work to help us instead of what he did, which was to hurt us. She took a young boy by the name of Peter who had an extreme fear of rabbits. I personally ask, how did he become afraid of rabbits? They seem pretty, I don't know, pretty cute and cuddly to me. Jones gave Peter his favorite food while slowly bringing the rabbit closer and closer. Eventually, Peter no longer panicked around rabbits, showing that systematic desensitization could help people overcome their fear. So, how do we use all this classical conditioning stuff in everyday life? Well, honestly, it's used in advertising all the time. Like many beer ads prominently feature attractive young women wearing bikinis. The young women are their unconditioned stimulus. They naturally elicit a favorable, mildly aroused feeling for some of you, and that feeling would be your unconditioned response. The beer is simply associated with this effect. How about this example? The smell of fresh bread baking makes my mouth water. I've told you I like pumpkin. I'm making pumpkin bread this weekend. It is going to make my mouth water all over the place. So, in the past, the smell of fresh bread immediately preceded putting a piece in my mouth, which causes salivation. Through the mechanism of classical conditioning, now the smell itself comes to elicit salivation. Good pumpkin bread. Alcoholics. Another way to treat alcoholics is to have them take a drug called anabuse. Anabuse basically makes them very ill if they take it and they drink alcohol. So if they ingest any alcohol, I mean, we're talking serious vomiting issues. The desire is to pair the vomiting with the alcoholic drink so that they will not want to drink anymore. Okay, so here is where you guys get to come up with your own example. I know on here it says through a group share, because we're not having class today, you don't get group share. So I want you to write one down individually about an example of how maybe you've been conditioned. Okay, and I want you in your example to write out the terms of unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, so untrained, versus trained, which is the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Have that written down. I'd love it if it were just typed up really briefly, but you can just handwrite it, put your name on it, because I will be asking for that and it will be worth some points. Okay, so I will see you next class, hopefully. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.